Thank you very much for joining us today on this webinar on how to create effective BI reports. And we will use this time to look through more focus on the industry rather than the theoretical background of data visualization and business intelligence. So without further ado, let's move on to the industry challenge. So please, if you have any questions, as I've mentioned previously, use the chat or remember the page number you see in the right lower corner of the screen. And let's begin with the problem statement. We have seen too many poorly designed BI reports and dashboards flooding our market, which could lead to low usage and ultimately lost opportunities for business. These poorly designed reports might also lead to frustration, cognitive overload for the user, and also disengagement. We often see reports similar to this one. Now, this one might look super good at first, but when you sit down and try to analyze this one, you will find, for example, it's unnecessary to use the background image, or the space is not utilized properly, or the chart choices are not the optimal one. And we can often see many other different poorly designed reports out there, but my absolute favorite one is the table. I call this one your customer's favorite exporting tool back to Excel. Now, if you end up in a situation like this, then it's really time to rethink how we can try to communicate with the stakeholders to make them understand that even though this is a good option for looking at row level, but when it comes to BI reporting and visualization, this one is not as optimal. On top of this challenge, we have also conducted a short survey with a subsample of 10 BI professionals from well-known and established companies, consulting companies in the Nordics, to ask them about the challenges they encounter when they create these reports. We found out that 60% of them are creators, meaning they design and build visual reports or somehow dashboards. 20% of them are decision makers, meaning some type of management, and the other 20% are consumers. But 40% of them spend more than 10 hours creating and consuming the reports, which means that if you are spending this much time to either create or consume BI reports, you have to somehow create effective reports to both save some time, some headache for the end users, and so on. So when we asked them how relevant is data visualization in your role, most of them said 4 and above. And when they commented on what type of challenges, it was report design, it was more of integrating which chart should be in the report, striking a balance between the reports. While these are all really good points these subsamples brought up, we will merely focus on the implementing unique designs to enhance visual appeal. So if we do not do that, if we do not care about implementing effective reports, why do we end up in these type of poorly designed reports? Well, often the developer might lack formal education in data visualization, or they might have some type of visual literacy, inadequate data visualization practices. They have lack of user-centric design thinking. They might lack some inconsistency standards from the company they work at, or they bring in with them the subjectivity from their background because they might have been pushed or nudged, let's say, from their manager to become a BI developer, but in the background they might be just a person that is interested in BI, and they have been pushed to that, and they come with diverse backgrounds. So when we see these many poorly designed reports, and we know that the person might lack some knowledge in how to create these effective reports, and the customers do not know what they want, we can also assume that they know nothing about BI. When we end up in a situation where the developer doesn't have the proper theoretical background in creating effective reports, and the customer doesn't know, or they have some type of standardized way to work with tables, or they have been taught this way from beginning and they refuse to actually accept change, then we often end up with the reports going unused. It can lead to information accessibility issues in the reports. It leads to cognitive overload in these reports. We are wasting a lot of time and effort and resources into this, and at the end it's decreasing engagement in the user. Now, why should we care about this? Well, when we measure performance improves according to Pearson's law. But when we also report the feedback, it accelerates, the improvement accelerates. So that being said, when there are a lot of poorly designed reports and we need to try to understand why and how can we improve this? Well, that's why I come in this picture here. My vision, or our vision for Data&People, is to educate and elevate business intelligence creation within the community so that we can decrease the poorly designed reports. So if that is the circle you're seeing in front of you, then we have looked at the gap and understood the industry, why we are creating so many. I have a PhD in data visualization, so I have worked in this area for a bit now, and I understand how to create and how to try to figure out why we are having these poorly designed reports, and also some type of teaching behind me. Then my passion is to share this knowledge with the industry, with the community, with people such as you sitting in this audience. But bear in mind that I'm not trying to make this webinar an academic one, and I'm not claiming that you are creating poorly designed reports. I'm just saying in general there are many poorly designed reports out there, and we want to teach and educate people so that we can minimize that. So we are not here to judge you or your work. Hopefully we will be learning something really valuable today. So the learning outcome of this webinar is to gain a deeper understanding of data visualization, but also how can we create good reports based on this theory for optimal impact. Now, that being said, let's look over the steps we have created for you. So, like anything else, following some steps can lead to good results. So we do not want to overcomplicate the process. Therefore, this checklist is based on both theory I have with me from my PhD, but also industry experience we have seen, and also the short market research we've done. So the steps are the following. We always want to start simple. We want to provide a clear context. We want to optimize the visual layout for the report and also for the user. We want to be able to understand how do we select appropriate visuals and which ones are appropriate to select for different types of data. Refine for impact and also somehow implement a commitment to continuous improvement as BI developer. Now, we will touch these topics, but we will not go into depth of all of them. Some of them we will go a little bit deeper than others. And it's always good to use an example. So what we will be doing today, we will go through these steps with a existing example downloaded from Microsoft's own webpage. But before we go further into these steps, we need to somehow understand a little bit on data visualization and visual representations. So let's start very basic. Let's start with defining data visualization. Data visualization is the result of various scientific disciplines striving to interpret data effectively. And the demand for data visualization and data analytics skills has never been higher as it is today. So it is always a good idea to refresh our memory. What do we mean by data visualization? Understanding that maybe will lead to some ideas on where you need to improve, or just for curiosity, learn more about. So defining data visualization, we can use this one you see in front of you, because there are many out there. For this specific webinar, we will use the one that states computer-based visualization systems that provide visual representations of data sets that are designed to help people carry out tasks more effectively. Well, that was a handful. Let's dissect that into keywords. So we have visual representations and we have data sets, but we also have people and tasks. And tasks in this specific sentence or situation means what type of thing does the user want to perform? Is it a financial report first of all? Do they want to understand trends over time, or do they want to understand some type of correlation between, and so on? So there are many different tasks that the end users can do. But to narrow down for the specific webinar, we will mainly focus on the end user, not that much, but a little bit, and also the visual representations, and also reports, as I've mentioned. But overall, what we want to do with visualization is to combine human visual perception with the power of technology to display the information expressively, effectively, and appropriately. Now, to step one. So, providing a clear context. It's extremely important because within the first few seconds, the user will scan basic structure of your report. They will look at what type of visuals you're using, and they will create an initial feeling about your report. So let's make sure we follow some basic steps to enhance that for the user. So, if we do not direct the users to the most relevant and interesting or even helpful information, they will find their own path, which means that they will choose the path of minimum effort. This is something natural in all of us. And what does that mean? Well, we know that most of us read from left to right, and in Middle East, of course, from right to left, or other countries as well, areas and countries. So this is called F pattern or Z pattern, and you probably have heard this, or if you used it, or you're using it on a daily basis. But if the report does not have a structure, the user will automatically start from top left and then scan down. While they are scanning downwards and to the sides, they are losing focus and attention. More and more they go down. So knowing that, we want to be able to help them. We want to minimize the time they spend on different areas that are not of interest for the user or for the data for that matter. We want to maximize the benefit, and we want to do the work for the user instead of forcing them to find it themselves. We want to prioritize on the important things first, and these are very basic steps. But we also have many other types of patterns the user will automatically follow. It can be a lady cake, it could be a spotted, it could be a marking. But the important thing is in BI is to first provide the context, and in this case it means titles, subtitles, dates, what it is about, maybe the logos and so on. So how do we optimally place these? Well, I usually follow a very basic standard, because working with BI doesn't necessarily mean that you are creating the most beautiful or most aesthetic report. We do not want to do that because there is a balance between too beautiful and too information heavy. We want to be able to create some type of balance. So usually I put my titles and subtitles to the top left so that we can provide the context for the user quickly. They will scan either to the right quickly or also down. So we want to give them updated information. When was this data updated last time? Why was it? And so on. And then other information such as logos and who has signed in and so on. Usually we want to put it in the footer because that's not the important stuff here. So going back to our example, if we start with this year-to-date category trend analysis report, let's start first by removing everything. Let's make the page blank. What we can do then is we provide the context for the user. That means we put a better title, a subtitle to clarify even more, put the logo and who has created it at the bottom in the footer, because it's not that important to know. So having that, we can move on to step 2. Now it comes to the interesting part. So we want to optimize the layout, meaning we want to look at where do I place my visuals, how do I place them, and so on. While there are many different ways, there is no single one. So I usually start, as I said, very basic, and then we iterate with the end user. Maybe you want to have this here or there and so on. So we have a single KPI focus, we have a metric comparison, we have a metric overview and details and so on. But remember that there is no single correct way to lay out this report, which makes it more difficult for us BI developers to know which one should I use. Luckily, this will be less of a headache soon enough with Copilot, because you can just tell it how to structure it. More on that later on. We want to be careful so that we do not use a layout that is not optimal and follows the navigation patterns, for example, the F shape. So you might have noticed that there is a white space between the header and the visual. Well, you might also have noticed that we have not talked about filters. There are, in Power BI for example, many different ways where you can implement these filters. I usually put them close to the path of minimum effort, because that is a way to provide even more context for the user, because they want to drill down in the data set themselves. So I usually put them either below the header or to the left. But there's also a third option if you are a Power BI developer, where you can put them to the right side. And that is something that people usually do not like, because it's restricted first of all, and also they have not learned to use that. But we can use that one. So if we go back to our example, we can see that we have put our filters on the top, very close to the title, and provide even more context. So that being done, we can move on to step 3. How do we select the appropriate visual? Well, in order for us to select an appropriate visual, we need to know how visuals are created or what they are made of, for example. We can say that all visual representations consist of a canvas, marks, and channels. The canvas is just the layout we want to create the actual visual. The marks are the geometric primitives, and the channels are geometric attributes to those primitives. So what does that mean? Let's look a little bit deeper into the canvas. So we have linear, we have grid, and we have radial layouts for these, but we also have some spatial, we have some network, and we have other. And by other we mean here, for example, the pie chart. It does not have any axes, for example. So looking at the first 3, which are those that are mainly used in the industry, we can see that the linear one is good for comparison, showing data all the time, maybe some flow, while the pie chart, the radial one, is used for part of a whole, or percentage. Now we need to be careful with all of these, because going above a certain threshold, meaning 4 plus variables, these visuals start to get a little bit cluttery, especially the radial one, and we will come to that a little bit later, why the radial one is an extremely dangerous layout to use for certain types of data. Tables, which are the grid ones, are usually used for ranking and showing KPIs, but they are not so good for correlation, for example, correlating 2 columns between each other. And while browsing for information about these, I encountered this little example on Microsoft's support page, where Microsoft had answered that the user who had an issue with creating this visual for certain types of data, they suggested that the user would actually extend a slice of the pie with another pie or a bar chart. Now this might look extremely okay to do, but thinking about what the user will be doing and why they are showing this, it's a level of abstraction. It's a more difficult thing for the user, which will lead more challenge to the user and cognitive overload and misunderstanding and so on. So we need to be careful with using these type of pie charts especially. And there is a war between us who likes pie charts or who does not like pie chart. I personally think it should be used for very few variables and only certain types of variables. Moving on to the actual marks, we have points, we have lines, and we have areas. Well, areas usually are shown for distribution, comparison, pattern, trends, and so on, but they are not so good for precision in comparison or complex multivariate relationships. For example, if I want to compare 2 pie charts, it's not even unthinkable to even do. And the line, it's not so good for sparse or discrete data, and the points are very much used in a lot of visual representations for showing individual data points, highlight specific values, and so on. Moving on to the channels, we have precise positioning, for example, a scatter plot. We have length or size, We have different types of shapes, and we have hue and also tilt. Now you might not have thought about these while looking at, for example, a combination chart, where you show a bar chart, a column chart, and a line chart together. Now the top one, the position one, is extremely effective for showing spatiality encoded in the quantitative values, meaning that you can see exactly what the value is if you have not encoded another dimension on the actual dots. Alright, I think we do not need to go through all of these, but the key point here is, why are we showing this? Why is this important to know? Well, it turns out that apart from different layouts being useful for different types of data, the marks and channels are also perceived differently by us humans. So I will show two images, and I would like you to think about which one is more pleasant to look at. So if we move on to the next one, which one is more pleasant to look at? Now, these are not traffic signs for trains or anything, it's just trying to talk about the oblique effect, as you have read in the title over there. And what does that mean? Well, it turns out that we humans have far more cells for horizontal and vertical lines, which means that it leads to greater visual acuity than oblique angles, meaning everything between 90 and 0, for example, in the right chart you see there. And to take this a little bit further, people who live in the rainforest compared to those who live in North American plains do not display the same oblique effect, meaning that those in the rainforest have fewer horizontal cells than those in the North American plains who have fewer vertical cells. This is an interesting fact to know that we are different, but we are mainly made for vertical and horizontal lines. But cats, on the other hand, they can see all orientations. That's a bit annoying. Imagine if we had that. Moving on, so the channel effectiveness also plays a major role in selecting the appropriate visual. For example, Stevens' power law states that relationships between perceived intensity of a stimuli and its physical magnitude is above 2 times the actual value. And what does this mean? Well, if we look at, for example, the electric shock, the blue line we see here, it was perceived 2.5 times more than what the actual value was when the patients were shocked with a small electrical shock on their fingers. So these values are either magnified or compressed. Brightness, for example, is compressed. You have to show 5 times or 2.5 times more to be able to show the intensity of 2. And length has been shown to be almost exact the actual value they see. This brings us to this chart. So scales, which we have talked about a little bit, positioned on a common scale or a common scale, that is the most accurate one to use if we want to be precise, so the perceiving of it. But we also have length, we have angles, we have areas and so on, but they become less effective depending on how precise you want to be with the actual values that they need to read. This is for quantitative data, and we also have for qualitative data. So non-numeric. We can see, for example, spatial position is a effective one to use, for example, in a bubble chart. Then we have hue and motion and so on. And while I was working in a with a previous customer report, I encountered an example such as this one. Now, this one has been blurred out a little bit so that we keep the information confidential, and it's just the actual view we are interested in trying to criticize here. Well, we do not utilize the full space, for example. That's first thing we notice. The charts do not display any type of insight at all. They have used the wrong charts for the type of data, the colors, the menus, and so on. We can move on and on about this one. Going back to our example, we can start looking at, okay, what visuals are we using in this year-to-date analysis? Well, first of all, we want to display data over time. So we are using a tree map, we are using a map, we are using a line chart and a column chart. So the question is, do we need to show all this just to show year to date? Or is it just really beautiful to show these? Well, we want to kill the darlings here. It's really difficult, but we need to do that. So if we start here, what we can do, if you have guessed, we can remove the map. We do not need to use the map. While you might disagree there because it shows some regional distribution and can be used for filtering, I would say that a regular filter can also be used for filtering and takes far less space. So we remove the map. Now we can also see that the focus of our eye has shifted now. It goes towards the tree map because it takes a lot of space. Then the next question is, do we need to use a tree map to show this type of data? Well, we don't have that much that we want to display, so why not change it to a bar chart, a stack bar chart, which is vertical in this case. So now we have minimized and used the correct types of data to show trends over time and be able to filter based on region. So what we want to do next is to refine for impact. So what we have done so far is we have looked at providing a clear context, we have looked at optimizing visual layouts, and we have looked at selecting correct visuals. All these go under visual representation on our definition. Now what we have left to do is refine the design for impact and also embrace a continuous improvement mindset. Now these two fall on the user apart from the last one because that one is a little bit more on the developer. So if we look at refining the design, it comes down to understanding the user. So we humans have a perceptual system that has two fundamental different sensory modalities, meaning that we can identify and we can see magnitudes. So when it comes to identification, it's about what and where a certain thing that we have identified is, and also how much and how intense that thing is. Looking at it from a BI perspective, we can see that we can use coloring, for example, to categorize and identify that yellow is electronics and green is clothing. And magnitudes is basically a heat map could be an example to show level of satisfaction per country. The darker, the more satisfied, or the other way around. Now, when working with stakeholders, we also want to understand why do they not use the reports, for example. And one thing is our memory. It's important for us BI developers to to understand a little bit on memory. We don't need to go too deep into this, but a little bit on the memory. So let's look into that. We have sensory memory, we have short-term memory, and we have long-term memory. So when we have a world in front of us, we see things. It comes into our senses. In this case, sensory memory. We use our eyes, in this case, for business intelligence. So anything that is not a register is lost, and everything else, it goes to the thinking, which means the short-term memory. And as you might have noticed, the numbers there in the boxes indicate how quick this information passes through these stages. Less than a second for sensory memory and less than a minute for short-term memory. Same thing for short-term memory. If we do not rehearse and practice to increase this 1 minute gap, it will be lost. And then everything else, when we learn different types of topics and so on, it goes to the long-term memory, and then we can restore this back and forth. Sometimes we also have involuntarily storing bad memories, for example. But in BI, we primarily work with the sensory memory and the short-term memory. And this is important to know because you have less than a minute to grasp or to get their attention, to get the user's attention. And when we even put the 7 plus minus 2 magic number theory on top of the short-term memory, it becomes even more difficult. So now, coming back to the pie chart, for example, more than 4, it's already getting too much. Adding it to 7 and 9, it's getting a bit of a cognitive overload just on that specific visual. So what do we do when we have a lot of things to do? Well, in psychology, they call it chunking. So what we do is, for example, to remember a phone number or something, we chunk it into parts. And in data visualization, we do the same thing. While you might not have thought about it, we use grouping, we use visual hierarchies, we use color encoding, and so on. But sometimes we can do a bit too much, and working with color is something that is extremely challenging. So for this specific webinar, to keep it very light, we will not go deep into colors. We will merely mention, okay, so when you're working with colors, remember that, keep it very simple. For quantitative values, you have saturation, meaning sequential coloring, or you have divergent coloring to use. And often you don't need to think about this because the programs we are using have this built in. And for qualitative values, which is the more difficult one to work with, we have a hue, categorical. If we are not careful, well, we end up in situations like this. This is an actual example I was encountering in my previous assignments. And something like this, for example, or even worse, something like that. And the smiley faces are just for hiding sensitive information. If we are not careful with using color and understanding what type of channels we are using when we are using these type of visuals, we can end up in a situation where we are using many channels to show the same thing. For example, length and luminance. If we already show the length of the bars being the values that are higher, we don't need to color code it as well. Some people might say, well, it's for enhancing the effect that this is actually the highest one. True, but we don't want to overload the user. Remember that. So, going back to our example, we can see that the color here is the next thing we can work with. So we can start using the brand colors, in this case, the foresty yellow type of theme we have in our examples. Now we can impact even further for enhancing the design. Let's look a little bit into the whole report. how can we try to enhance this even more? Well, you might have encountered Gestalt principles before. We do not want to go into depth about these, but we have proximity, often also called object-related distance. We have similarity, we have figure ground, and we have enclosure. Objects that are placed close to each other, they somehow belong together. We understand that. We do not want to focus on these principles, we just want to use them in this case. So let's look at our example. What can we do? Well, let's start with these two. We enclose and we use figure ground to pop out the important parts from the actual background report. So now we have much more clearer view to show that this report is focusing on 3 parts only. And then we can enhance the titles a little bit more. And to show you the whole process, because I've talked a bit now, we can go through this little animated GIF. Alright, moving on to step 5, commit to a continuous improvement. This is more on the developer slash person who's an analyst working with different types of data. This is something extremely important and intuitive, and we understand this, but it's really difficult. I know myself, it's really difficult to keep this commitment. We want to, when we have created a report, it's not the end, and now it comes to the iteration. We want to get a good handle of the situation. We want to gather some feedback if we have not done that already. We want to sort through this feedback and prioritize. We want to update the report and train the user. And if we haven't done that, we want to do it. And if we have done it, we want to redo it because we have changed something. And we always need to figure out what is happening with the software we're using, with the data, how to handle data, with the communities we are in, and so on. So looking at the situation, we can use monitoring usage metrics in Power BI, and there are probably similar things in Tableau and Click and other platforms as well. We can use these apps to collect feedback. For example, Teams, which is not the optimal one, but it's highly used. We can use Forms, we can use Jammer, which is some type of social platform for Microsoft products, and we can use Azure test plans as well. Now, I've worked with all these, and I know that they are a bit tricky to work with when it comes to getting the feedback. Setting up these are really simple, but when you work with customers who have very little time to actually sit down and test or give you feedback or answer some questions and so on, and their time is extremely valuable, but we need to do this because we are doing this for them. So we need to figure out how to first of all convince them and also make them go through this. So that is something you will probably encounter as well. And the other 3 steps are: we sort through the feedback, we update the report and train, we stay on current new features in the report software we are using. Now I've talked a lot, so let's try to just finalize this webinar on the basic steps we have gone through. So when you go back to your daily tasks today, tomorrow, next week, and so on, remember to first provide a simple and clear context. Optimize the visual layout. Select visual that is appropriate. Refine for impact and commit to continuous improvement. Now, sit down and think after the webinar. Are you following some type of similar steps, or are you just working ad hoc? And if you are, I think this could be a really good start. You don't have to exactly follow these steps. You can make them your own. You can add stuff, you can remove, but somehow starting with these basic steps, I think, will improve the way you are creating your reports. And that is the end of this webinar. Before we continue to our daily tasks and lives, I will show this little view here for convenience. Please keep us updated on if we have missed anything through email or our website, our LinkedIn, or even my personal LinkedIn. And if we have other topics that are coming in the future, stay up to date through our LinkedIn page, for example. And you see that later in autumn we will be starting to offer a more advanced course on how do we deal with these type of situations where AI is taking over more and more. What am I supposed to do as a developer? Well, if you have listened through this webinar, you will understand that visualization is not going anywhere. We still need to understand how to create good reports, even though the AI is doing most of the work. So we will offer that course later on in autumn. And I have created a 5-page or more PDF summary of this webinar. You can download through the QR code there. And if it's inconvenient with scanning the code, I will also send out a summary email after this webinar. But please do fill in the survey so that we can improve this webinar for future attendees and enhance the webinar for the community and so on.